She has been running for 3 years. New name, new city, new face behind a polished smile. But tonight, the past walked through the front door of her restaurant, and it had a face she recognized. The most feared man in Chicago sat down at table 9, ordered nothing, and watched her. Not the way customers watch, the way predators watch. Vivian Marlowe gripped the edge of her serving tray and told herself to breathe, but her leg was already burning, and the man at table 9 had already noticed the way she favored her left side. He noticed everything. If this story already has you gripping your seat, hit that like button right now, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and let's see how far this story can travel. Stay until the very end. You will not want to miss what happens next. Botan. The limp was her most dangerous secret, and she had spent 6 weeks perfecting the lie. Every night, Vivian Marlowe came into Castellanos through the service entrance on Walker Drive, tied her black apron in the narrow hallway that smelled of garlic and old dishwater, and spent exactly 11 minutes on her feet before the pain started. She knew the exact rotation of tables that kept her walking in straight lines. She knew which customers tipped generously and sat near the bar, saving her from crossing the full length of the dining room unnecessarily. She knew how to plant her right foot slightly ahead of her left when she stopped to take an order, shifting weight so naturally that nobody ever looked twice. Nobody except herself, in the bathroom mirror at the end of every shift, watching the bruise-colored exhaustion spread across her face. She was 31 years old, and she moved like a woman twice that age when the restaurant finally emptied. Outside Chicago in March was punishing. Wind came off the lake like something with a grudge, and Vivian had learned to walk faster on sidewalks, so the cold gave her an excuse for the stiffness in her gait. Inside Castellanos, with its warm amber lighting and the soft sound of Italian piano drifting from hidden speakers, she had no such cover. Inside, she had to be perfect. She carried 3 entrees to table 7, the ossobuco for the man in the gray suit, the branzino for his wife, the risotto for the daughter who was barely paying attention to her food and kept checking her phone, and set each plate down without a tremor, without a wince, without a single breath that came out wrong. "Enjoy," Vivian said, and smiled the smile she had practiced. The wife thanked her. The daughter didn't look up. The man in the gray suit watched her walk away with the particular attentiveness of someone who paid $400 for a dinner and believed that entitled him to an opinion on everything in the room, including the staff. Vivian felt his gaze on her back until she rounded the service partition. The moment she was out of sight, she pressed her palm flat against the wall and exhaled slowly through her nose. Her hip flexor was on fire. The physical therapist she'd seen twice 3 years ago, before she ran out of money, before she ran out of options, had told her the nerve damage from the injury would never fully heal. She had nodded and never gone back. She didn't have time to think about that now. Table 11 was waiting on their wine, and the storm that had been building over the lake since mid-afternoon was finally arriving, drumming rain hard against the tall front windows. It was the sound of the rain intensifying that made her look toward the entrance. The door opened, and the air in the room changed. She would not have been able to explain that to anyone, not precisely. The piano kept playing. The other conversations in the room continued. Nothing stopped. And yet something shifted the way pressure shifts before a temperature drop, something invisible and total, and every instinct Vivienne had spent 3 years sharpening went quiet and cold. Alessandro Virelli walked into Castellanos like he owned it, because he probably did in some form she wasn't aware of and didn't want to know about. He was taller than she expected. She had seen photographs, the kind that circulated in the darker corners of the city's institutional knowledge, the kind passed between people who kept track of such things for professional or survival reasons. In photographs, he looked severe. In person, he looked like severity was only the surface of something much colder underneath. He wore a dark coat, unbuttoned, not because he was careless, but because he didn't feel the cold the way other people did. 2 men entered behind him and immediately positioned themselves near the entrance and the bar without a word exchanged between them. Virelli himself crossed the room with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never once in his adult life been asked to wait. The maitre d', Marco, who had worked at Castellanos for 19 years and had served governors, federal judges, and one sitting senator, moved to intercept Varelli with the particular deference of someone who understood exactly what category of guest had just arrived. Vivian watched Marco lead him to the private table in the far corner, the one that had been set for a party of 4 but was now being quietly rearranged for one. She should have gone to the wine station. She should have attended to table 11. Instead, she stood motionless behind the service partition for 3 seconds longer than she should have, watching Alessandro Varelli settle into his chair, unbutton his jacket, and begin surveying the room with the patient, systematic attention of a man who cataloged everything he saw. His gaze moved clockwise, unhurried. The entrance, the bar, the other tables, the staff near the kitchen. It reached the service partition. Vivian stepped back. Her hip protested the sudden movement, and she gripped the partition edge to steady herself, breath caught, heart doing something ugly in her chest that had nothing to do with physical pain. Lena, the other floor waitress on the evening shift, appeared at her elbow. Lena was 24 and enthusiastic in a way that Vivian found exhausting on normal evenings and acutely dangerous right now. "Marco wants you to handle table 9, Lena said, nodding toward the private corner. "He said specifically you. Said you're his most composed server." Vivian stared at the back of Alessandro Varelli's head. "Tell Marco I've got 11 and 7 tonight," she said, keeping her voice level. "You take 9. Lena's expression shifted to something cautious. "He said specifically you, Viv. I think the guest requested someone experienced." "The guest?" She almost laughed. "Fine," she said. She spent 45 seconds at the wine station, straightened her apron, rolled her right shoulder back, then her left, checked that her notepad was in her left apron pocket and her pen was clipped where she could access it without fumbling. These were small things. These were the only things she could control right now, and so she controlled them with precision. Then she walked to table 9. Alessandro Varelli didn't look up when she arrived at his table. He was reading something on his phone with the focused disinterest of a man who read contracts the way other people read menus, out of necessity rather than interest. His hands were large, knuckles prominent, the kind of hands that suggested a history the expensive suit and composed manner were meant to offset. "Good evening," Vivian said. Her voice came out exactly right, warm, professional, unhurried. "Welcome to Castellanos. Can I start you with something to drink while you wait for your party?" He looked up. His eyes were dark gray and carried no social warmth whatsoever. Not hostile. Simply calibrated for observation rather than connection, the way a camera lens is not cruel, but also will not miss anything placed in front of it. He looked at her face for exactly 1 second. Then his gaze dropped, briefly and without any apparent self-consciousness, to her left side. "Sparkling water," he said. "And you can tell Marco that my party arrived 10 minutes ago." He meant himself. He was the party. "Of course," Vivian said. "I'll let him know you're ready when you'd like to see the menu." "I know the menu." She nodded and turned to go. "Your left hip," he said. She stopped. "It's been bothering you since you walked over." His voice was quiet, conversational, the way someone might mention that it was raining outside. "You're compensating on the right. You've been doing it all evening." Vivian did not turn around immediately. She took exactly 1 breath, made the decision about what version of this conversation she was willing to have, and then turned back to face him. "I pulled a muscle last week," she said. "It's nothing." Alessandro Varelli looked at her for another second, not unkindly, not with prurient curiosity, just with the particular quality of someone who had spent decades in proximity to people telling him what they thought he wanted to hear and had stopped finding it interesting. "Sparkling water," he said again, returning his gaze to his phone. She went back to the wine station and stood there for a moment longer than she needed to, hands flat on the cool marble surface, waiting for her pulse to normalize. He noticed. He noticed in approximately 90 seconds what she had successfully concealed from every other person in this restaurant for 6 weeks. The rain intensified against the windows. The next 2 hours were the longest of her life at Castellanos. She brought him his water. She brought him what turned out to be a modest order. Grilled branzino, no pasta, a glass of Barolo that Marco selected personally. She executed every approach and departure from his table with the precision of someone diffusing something. He didn't speak to her except to order and to offer a brief, toneless thank you, when his food arrived, but she felt him watching, not continuously, not intrusively, with the intermittent and absolute attention of someone who had identified a point of interest and was in no hurry to resolve it. The restaurant filled and thinned as the storm peaked and began to ease. By 10:30, most of the tables had turned over and only a few late parties remained. Varelli's men at the bar drank soda water and watched the room. Varelli himself had finished eating and was making calls, his voice inaudible from across the dining room, but visible in the controlled set of his jaw and the stillness of his posture. At 10:55, Marco told Vivienne and Lena they could begin closing procedures on their respective sections. Varelli's men had settled the check. Marco handled it himself, never bringing it to the table, and the private corner had gone quiet. Vivienne assumed he'd left. She didn't look. She focused on turning her tables, collecting linen, resetting for the morning crew. The pain in her hip had graduated from sharp to deep and grinding, the kind that meant she'd pushed past the threshold where ignoring it was responsible. She would take 3 ibuprofen when she got home, put ice on it for 20 minutes, and be back here tomorrow night doing exactly this. She was loading the last of her section's glassware onto a tray when she heard the kitchen door open behind her. Not the main kitchen entrance, the secondary one, the narrow corridor that led to the alley exit, the one that staff used to take garbage out and that was supposed to be locked from the inside after 10. She turned. The man standing in the corridor doorway was not kitchen staff. He was medium height, thick through the chest, wearing a jacket she recognized. Not the jacket itself, the style, the cut, the particular way a jacket was tailored when it needed to conceal something worn beneath the left arm. She had grown up around men who dressed exactly this way, and she had spent years teaching herself to unsee it, unknow it, forget the language of it. Her body remembered before her mind caught up. Tony Caruso. She hadn't seen his face in 4 years, but it hadn't changed enough to matter. He worked for her brother. He had been in the car the night her brother's men had taken her to the warehouse to teach her what happened to family members who refused to participate. He had watched them break her leg, and he had not looked away. He smiled at her now from across the dim restaurant, and the smile didn't reach his eyes because it was never meant to. Vivienne Marcelli, he said, low and even, as if he were simply confirming an item on a list. Took us a while. You're good at disappearing. The tray in her hands was heavy. She set it down on the nearest table without looking at it, without looking away from him. You've got the wrong person, she said. You want to try that again, or should we just skip it? He stepped into the room, hands relaxed at his sides. The corridor behind him was empty. The kitchen was empty. Lena had gone to the coat room. Marco was in the office. Raphael wants to see you. He said to tell you there's no point in running this time. He knows where you are. He knows where you've been. He wants to have a conversation. Tell Raphael. Don't. His voice sharpened, just slightly. Don't tell me what to tell Raphael. I've been looking for you for 8 months, Vivienne. I'm not in the mood. She measured the distance to the front entrance. 30 feet, maybe 35. Past him was not an option. Around him, if she moved fast and took the pain, she's not going anywhere. The voice came from behind her. She turned. Alessandro Virelli stood near the bar, jacket still on, hands loose at his sides. She had no idea how long he'd been there. She had no idea how he moved that quietly in a room with hardwood floors. His 2 men materialized from somewhere, the coat room, the corridor near the bathrooms, and flanked the space between Caruso and the exit with the practiced ease of people for whom this was simply an occupational context. Caruso's composure adjusted. Not broke. Men who worked for families like Raphael Marcelli didn't break easily, but adjusted, recalculating. This isn't your business, Virelli, Caruso said. She's in my restaurant, Alessandro said. That makes it my business. There was a silence that lasted about 4 seconds and felt considerably longer. Vivienne stood exactly between them, equidistant, the absurdity of the geometry of it occurring to her distantly through the roar of adrenaline filling her ears. Caruso looked at her, at Alessandro, at his own men. She counted 2 near the corridor, and at Alessandro's, and made the calculation that she could see him making. This isn't finished, Caruso said. No, Alessandro agreed. It isn't. Caruso left through the alley door. The sound of the corridor door shutting was very quiet, and then the room was just the hum of the refrigerators and the rain on the windows, and Alessandro Varelli looking at her with those gray eyes that missed nothing. She realized her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Known what, specifically?" His voice was calm, not gentle. He didn't seem like a man who defaulted to gentle, but level, without the edge that Caruso had brought into the room. "That I wasn't who I said I was." Alessandro was quiet for a moment. "I know what Raphael Marcelli's men look like," he said. "I know what it looks like when someone is being hunted and doesn't want anyone to know. You walked to my table 11 times tonight. You varied your path every single time." She hadn't realized she'd done that. "I'm not," she started and then stopped, because the sentence had nowhere honest to go. "You're not going back out there tonight," Alessandro said. "My car is in the alley. We'll go somewhere you can be seen by a doctor, and then you're going to tell me your real name." "I don't need your protection," she said. It came out with more heat than she intended. He looked at her steadily. "The man who just walked out of here has been inside this restaurant. He knows your schedule. He knows what exit you use." He paused. "You do need it. You just don't want it from someone like me." The rain outside had softened to something steady and cold. The refrigerators hummed. She thought about the 11 minutes she got every night before the pain started. She thought about the bathroom mirror. She thought about the name she'd given herself 3 years ago, standing in a parking lot in Indianapolis with $40 in her pocket and a passport in the name of a woman who no longer existed. Vivian Marlowe looked at Alessandro Varelli and understood, in the particular way that people who have survived bad situations understand things, that she had just run out of options. "Vivian," she said. "My name is Vivian. The rest of it—" She stopped. "The rest of it you're going to have to earn." Something moved in his expression. Not warmth, exactly. Something more complicated than warmth. "Fair enough," he said. He walked toward the door, and after a moment she followed. In the alley, the rain had almost stopped. His car was exactly where he said it was. A black sedan with a driver already behind the wheel who didn't react when they emerged from the service entrance. Alessandro's 2 men took a second vehicle that appeared from somewhere down the block with the quiet efficiency of a machine that was always running, always ready. She got into the back seat beside him, and he didn't speak and she didn't speak, and the city moved past the rain-blurred windows, and somewhere between the restaurant and wherever they were going, Vivian allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she'd been suppressing for 6 weeks. She wasn't safe here. She hadn't been safe anywhere. And the man sitting 3 feet away from her in this car, the man who had watched her limp and said nothing until it mattered, was not the danger she needed to be afraid of. The danger had already found her, and it had a message from her brother. The medical facility was not a hospital. It was on the 14th floor of a glass building in River North that had no signage on the exterior and a lobby that looked like a private members club, all dark marble and low lighting, and a receptionist who didn't ask for insurance information because the people who came here didn't use insurance. A doctor named Reyes met them at the elevator. Small woman, late 40s, the kind of calm that came from years of working in situations where panic was a liability. And she didn't ask Vivian any questions that weren't strictly clinical. Alessandro waited outside the examination room. Vivian sat on the table in her work clothes and let Reyes move through the assessment with quiet efficiency. The doctor's hands were cold and precise. She pressed along the outer hip, the iliotibial band, the place where the old fracture had healed at a slight angle because it had never been properly set. "This was a break," Reyes said, not a question. "Yes." "How long ago?" 4 years. Reyes made a sound that wasn't quite sympathetic and wasn't quite professional, something in between. She continued pressing, and Vivian stared at the wall and focused on breathing through the places where it hurt instead of making any sound at all. "You've been walking on this without any intervention?" "I've been managing it." "You've been damaging it," Reyes said. "Managing implies a sustainable strategy." Vivian didn't answer that. When it was done, Reyes wrapped the hip, gave her a compression sleeve, told her she needed imaging within the week and rest within the next 24 hours, and handed her 2 small orange pill bottles without elaborating on what they were. Vivian didn't take them. She set them on the table beside her and looked at them. He pays you, she said. Reyes glanced up from her notes. Yes. So your loyalty is to him. My loyalty is to the patient in front of me, Reyes said. But I also understand why you'd think otherwise. She picked up her clipboard. The rap will help tonight. The rest is your choice. She left. The door closed quietly. Vivian sat alone for a moment. The room was very clean and very still. Somewhere in the building, a ventilation system moved air with a low, even hum. She thought about the alley door. She thought about Tony Caruso's smile and the way it never reached his eyes. She thought about Raphael, who she hadn't seen in 4 years and who she had hoped, with the desperate irrationality of someone who knew better, she would never have to see again. She put the pill bottles in her apron pocket and got off the table. Alessandro was in the corridor, leaning against the opposite wall with his arms loose at his sides, phone dark in his hand, not pretending to be occupied with anything. He looked at her when she came out, and his gaze went briefly to the compression sleeve visible below her uniform hem and then back to her face. Sit down, he said, and nodded toward a room at the end of the hall that turned out to be a small, spare lounge. 2 chairs, a low table, a window looking out at the city that was still wet and glittering from the rain. She didn't want to sit. She sat anyway because her hip was suggesting that standing for the next hour was going to be a punishment she hadn't earned yet. Alessandro took the chair across from her. He didn't pour anything, didn't offer anything, didn't arrange the room to make it feel less like what it was. He just sat and looked at her and waited with the particular patience of a man who had learned that silence was more effective than pressure. She lasted about 40 seconds. My name is Vivienne Marcelli, she said. He didn't react, which told her he already knew. Raphael is my brother, she continued. Half-brother, technically. Different mothers. Our father ran the Marcelli organization out of the South Side for 22 years before he died, and Raphael took over. She stopped. You know all of this. I know some of it, Alessandro said. I want to hear your version. My version isn't different from the facts. Your version is always different from the facts, he said. Not unkindly, just as a statement of observable reality. That's what makes it useful. She looked at her hands. The shaking had stopped somewhere between the restaurant and here, replaced by the particular flatness that came after adrenaline finished burning through a system and left nothing behind but exhaustion and clarity. I was 24 when I told Raphael I wouldn't do it anymore, she said. I'd been running logistics for the organization since I was 19. I wasn't moving product. I was moving money, documentation. I was good at it because I was quiet, and I looked like nobody's idea of a threat. She paused. When I told him I was done, he thought it was a phase. When I told him I was leaving, he stopped thinking it was a phase. The warehouse, Alessandro said. She looked up. I heard about it, he said. Not the details, but I heard about it. Then you know enough. I know what I was told by people with their own interests in the telling, he said. That's not the same thing. She studied his face for a moment. He wasn't performing concern. He wasn't performing anything. He was just sitting there in his expensive jacket with his gray eyes and waiting for her to decide how much was worth saying. They broke my leg, she said. 2 of his men. Raphael watched. He said it was to remind me that leaving was a concept, not a reality. That I could physically walk out of his world, but I could never actually leave it. She held his gaze. He was almost right, but not entirely. I left anyway, with a broken leg and $40 and a contact in Indianapolis who owed my mother a favor. I spent 6 months disappearing, 3 cities, 4 jobs, 2 new names. Vivian Marlowe is the one that stuck. She exhaled. I thought it was enough. 8 months is a long time to look for someone who doesn't want to be found. Not for someone with the resources Raphael has rebuilt, Alessandro said. No, apparently not. She shifted in the chair and regretted it. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. I'm not your problem. You were in my restaurant when one of Marcelli's men came to collect you, he said. That makes it a statement about my house. I don't tolerate statements about my house. So this is about your reputation. Partly. She looked at him. What's the other part? He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, thinking. You hid for 6 weeks in a restaurant full of people who should have noticed, he said. You did it well. You did it without help from anyone. That takes a particular kind of discipline. He paused. I don't meet many people with that kind of discipline. It was not a compliment exactly. It was an observation, which somehow made it more unnerving than a compliment would have been. I'm not staying here, she said. Whatever arrangement you have in mind, protection detail, safe house, whatever language you use for it, I'm not interested. I've already spent years being managed by powerful men who thought they knew what was best for me. I'm not managing you. You brought me to your building. You had just been cornered by a man who broke your leg on your brother's orders, he said, voice still even. I brought you somewhere safe. Those are not the same thing. They feel the same. I understand that, he said, but feeling and being are different problems. She stared at him. Don't do that. Do what? Be reasonable. It's harder to argue with. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, it didn't reach that far, but the suggestion of one, somewhere behind the composure. It was gone before she could be certain it was there. You have two problems, he said. The first is that Tony Caruso knows where you work and what your schedule is, which means that location is no longer safe for you. The second is that if Raphael sent Caruso, he already has a next move planned. Caruso is not a primary operative. He's a delivery mechanism. He was there to confirm the location and issue the message. I know how Raphael operates, she said tightly. Then you know waiting is not an option, he said. She wanted to argue with that. She didn't because he was correct. What do you want in return? She said. People like you don't offer things without wanting something back. People like me, he repeated. Not offended, just noting it. You know what I mean. I know what you've decided I am, he said. That's not quite the same thing. He stood, smoothed the front of his jacket with a single motion, and moved toward the window. Outside, the city was settling into the quieter part of the night, the part after midnight where the traffic thinned and the lights reflected off wet pavement in long orange streaks. Go home if you want. My men will make sure you arrive safely. After that, your choices are your own. That's it? That's it. She watched the back of him, the set of his shoulders, the way he stood at the window, the way people stand when they're used to viewing things from above, assessing rather than simply looking. You didn't answer the question, she said. What do you want in return? He turned to look at her over his shoulder. Information about your brother's current operations would be useful, but I'm not asking for it tonight. He paused. Tonight I'm asking for nothing. She didn't believe that entirely, but she believed it enough. She left at midnight with two of his men in a separate car, and the compression sleeve tight on her hip, and the 2 orange pill bottles still in her apron pocket. They dropped her at the apartment building on Huron Street where she rented a studio on the 3rd floor under her current name. The men waited until she was inside the building entrance before the car moved. She stood in the small lobby and listened to the car pull away, and then climbed the stairs slowly, one hand on the railing, letting herself make the sounds she'd been suppressing all evening. Her apartment was exactly as she left it, small, clean, almost empty in the way of someone who hadn't fully committed to staying anywhere. A bed, a second-hand couch, a kitchen table with 2 chairs because the set had come with 2 chairs, and she'd never bothered getting rid of the extra one. A window that faced the back of the building next door and a fire escape she'd confirmed twice could support her weight if it ever needed to. She sat on the edge of the bed without taking off her coat and stared at the wall for a long time. Then she got up, went to the closet, and pulled a backpack down from the shelf. It was already packed. It had been packed since the first week she'd arrived in Chicago, because old habits from the disappearing years didn't go away just because you wanted them to. She set it on the bed and looked at it. Then she left it there and went to the kitchen and put water on for tea she probably wouldn't drink, and stood at the counter and thought about the fact that she was standing in her kitchen at 1 a.m. after being cornered by a man who'd watched someone break her leg, thinking about Alessandro Varelli's voice when he said, "Tonight, I'm asking for nothing." She thought about that for a long time. She did not touch the backpack. 3 days passed in a way that felt more like a controlled experiment than ordinary time. She did not go back to Castellanos. She called Marco and told him she had a family emergency, which was true in a way that would have required too much context to explain. Marco, who was a decent man operating a restaurant that Alessandro Varelli apparently held some financial interest in, told her her position would be held. She didn't leave the apartment much. When she did, she took different routes and checked reflections in shop windows and moved the way she'd learned to move during the 6 months she'd spent disappearing. Casually, purposefully, never lingering in predictable patterns. On the second day, one of Alessandro's men, she recognized him from the restaurant, the taller one who'd been near the coat room, appeared in the coffee shop across the street from her building. He didn't look at her. He bought a coffee and sat by the window and read something on his phone. He was there for 2 hours, and then he wasn't. On the third day, Alessandro called. She'd given him a number. She wasn't sure when she'd decided to do that, but she had, and the phone rang mid-afternoon while she was sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad covered in her own handwriting. Timelines, names, assets she could remember, the geography of what she knew about Raphael's current operations assembled from the fragments of information she'd passively accumulated over 4 years of hearing things she hadn't tried to hear. She looked at the screen, answered. "There's something you need to know," he said, without preamble. "My people have been tracking Caruso's movements since the restaurant. He made contact with someone in my organization the next morning." The air in the apartment shifted. "Who?" she said. "A man named Donahue. He's been with me for 11 years. He runs coordination for the North Side operations." Donahue went to Caruso. "Caruso came to him," Alessandro said. "The distinction may not matter much practically, but I want to be accurate." She pressed her palm flat against the legal pad. "What did they discuss?" "We don't know the full content, but the meeting lasted 40 minutes, and Donahue lied about it when I asked him directly." "What did you do?" A brief pause. "I'm managing it." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I can give you right now." She stood up from the table, walked to the window, walked back. The compression sleeve was doing something at least. The edge of the pain was duller than it had been 3 days ago. "If Donahue is communicating with Caruso, that means Raphael has someone inside your organization. That means anything you know about my location is potentially compromised," he said. "Yes, I know." "Then why are you calling me on a line that—" "This line is clean," he said. "I'm not calling you on anything connected to my regular operations. I'm calling you on a phone that doesn't exist." She stopped pacing. Outside, the street noise drifted up, a truck downshifting, someone's music from a passing car, the ordinary texture of the city that she had learned to use as white noise, as cover, as proof that the world outside was still proceeding normally regardless of what was happening inside. "What does Raphael want?" Alessandro asked. "Specifically, you know him, not what Caruso said at the restaurant. What does he actually want?" She had been thinking about this for 3 days. It was the question she kept returning to, the one she'd been writing around on the legal pad without writing directly. "He said I was the heir to hidden assets," she said slowly. "Caruso mentioned that at the restaurant before you were there. He didn't say those words exactly, but that was what he meant. Raphael has been restructuring since our father died. There are accounts, holdings, properties that were put in names that aren't his, names that belong to family members who were supposed to remain loyal. Your name. My mother's name, technically, which passed to me." She exhaled. "I don't have access to those accounts. I never did. I didn't even know the extent of what was in them until about a year before I left, when I started understanding what the documentation I was moving actually meant." "But you could access them," Alessandro said. "Legally, with the right paperwork." "Theoretically. That's what he wants. Not you as a symbol. He wants the assets." She'd known this. Hearing him say it out loud made it concrete in a different way. "And if he gets them," she said, "he's not going to let me walk away afterward." "No," Alessandro said. "He won't." There was a silence. Outside, the truck finished downshifting, and the music from the passing car faded down the block. "I want to come in," she said. A pause. "Come in." "To wherever you are. I'm not staying in this apartment waiting for the next Caruso. I'll give you everything I know about Raphael's operations, the assets, all of it. In exchange, I need to be somewhere that isn't here." "That's a significant offer," he said. "I know what it's worth." "I want to be clear about something," he said. "If you come in, you're not a prisoner. You're not an asset I'm managing. You retain your own choices. That's not something I'm willing to have a misunderstanding about." She thought about the warehouse. about what it meant to be in a room with a powerful man and have your choices systematically removed until the only thing left was compliance or pain. She thought about how different Alessandro's version of this conversation felt from every other version of this conversation she'd ever had, and she tried to figure out if that difference was real or if she was too tired and too scared to assess it properly. She decided to go anyway, because the alternative was the backpack on the bed and another 6 months of disappearing, and she wasn't certain she had another 6 months of that left in her. "I'll be ready in an hour," she said. She arrived at his building, a converted industrial property in the West Loop that projected money and discretion in equal intentional measure, at 4:15 in the afternoon, with the backpack over one shoulder and the legal pad in her hand. His man let her in. Led her to a floor she hadn't been on before, a workspace that occupied the top level and had the organized, functional quality of somewhere that things were actually decided rather than simply discussed. 3 people she didn't know looked up when she entered and then looked back at their work, the kind of lack of reaction that was itself a form of professionalism. Alessandro was at a table on the far side of the room. He had his jacket off, sleeves rolled, and he was looking at something spread across the table that he covered when she approached, and then apparently reconsidered because he moved his hand and left it visible. It was a map, detailed. Chicago's South Side with markings she recognized. She had made similar markings herself, once in another life. She dropped the legal pad on the table beside the map. 3 years of what I know, she said. Routes, accounts, contact names, holding properties. It's not complete. Some of it may be outdated, but it's accurate to what I had access to. He looked at the pad, then at her. "Sit down." "I'm fine standing." "Your hip disagrees." She sat. They spent the next 2 hours going through what she knew. Alessandro asked questions that were specific and quiet, and revealed in their precision exactly how much he already understood about the architecture of what Raphael had built. She answered everything she could answer and said, I don't know when she didn't, without hedging, without softening it into something more useful sounding. Somewhere around the second hour, she noticed that the 3 other people in the room had gone quiet, not working, listening. She noticed Alessandro notice her noticing. He said something brief and quiet in Italian she didn't catch, and the 3 people collected their things and left the floor without comment. "Donahue is going to move," Alessandro said when they were alone. Whatever Raphael offered him, it was enough to make 11 years irrelevant. That tells me the offer is significant and the timeline is short. When? I don't know yet. He rolled his sleeves down, which she was learning was a gesture that meant he was shifting from analysis to something else. But I want you to understand something. When it happens, when Donahue makes his move, you are going to become the most direct leverage point either side could use. She understood what he was not quite saying. You're telling me that being here puts a target on me. I'm telling you that target already existed, he said. Being here means someone is standing between you and it. She looked at him. He was standing on the other side of the table with his jacket back on now, and the map still between them and the late afternoon light coming through the industrial windows, doing something to the planes of his face that made him look not softer exactly, but more accurately human than she'd allowed herself to see before. Why? She said. The real answer? Not the one about your house. He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer. Because I've been in this business for 17 years, he said, and I have never once watched someone hide a broken leg for 6 weeks and continue working and not ask a single person for help, and not thought... He stopped, looked at the map. You reminded me of something I'd stopped believing existed. What? He looked up. That there are people who survive things because of who they are, not because of who they're connected to. The room was very quiet. She looked down at the legal pad between them. At the handwriting she'd spent 3 days forcing herself to produce, every name and number dragged out of a past she'd wanted to permanently seal. She was about to respond when his phone rang. He looked at the screen, and something in his face shifted, barely perceptible, but she caught it because she had spent the last few hours learning to read the small movements that replaced expression in a man who kept most of himself behind glass. He answered, said nothing for several seconds. Then, where? A pause. Lock it down, he said. Don't touch Donahue until I'm there. He ended the call and looked at her with the particular quality of someone who has just confirmed something they were hoping was wrong. "Donahue moved," he said, 30 minutes ago. He cleared my secondary accounts and sent the access information to a Marcelli contact. He paused, and the pause was more precise than any expression. "And he told Raphael where you are." The city outside the windows continued its ordinary noise. Somewhere below, a door opened and there were footsteps and voices coming up fast. And Alessandro was already moving, his hand on the table edge, the other reaching for his phone again, and Vivienne sat in the chair with the legal pad in her hands and understood, with the clean and total certainty of someone who had run out of time, that whatever came through the door in the next 60 seconds was going to determine whether she had any future at all to worry about protecting. The footsteps on the stairs were wrong. Vivienne heard it before Alessandro did, or maybe she heard it differently, the way people who have spent years listening for the specific sound of threat in ordinary noise learn to separate signal from texture. It wasn't the sound of his men coming up with a report. It was too many feet, too fast, and there was a quality to the rhythm that she associated with people who were moving toward something rather than to someone. Alessandro was already at the far wall, where a panel she hadn't noticed before was open, and he was pulling a handgun from inside it with the practiced absence of drama that told her this was not a situation he found novel. "Stay behind the table," he said. "I'm not hiding behind a table." He looked at her for exactly 1 second. "Then stay on the left side of the room and don't move toward the door." She moved to the left side of the room. The door opened and it was Carver, one of Alessandro's men she'd seen twice now, the one with the close-cropped gray hair and the quiet way of occupying space. And his face was tight in a way that rewrote the geometry of the next few minutes. "Donahue's gone," Carver said. "He walked out of the Fulton Street office 20 minutes ago, left his phone, left his car, took nothing." He looked at Vivienne briefly, a look that held no hostility and no warmth, simply the registry of a complicating variable. "There's a vehicle on the street, 2 men. They've been there since 3 o'clock. "Marcelli's," Alessandro said. "Has to be. Plates are clean, but the car is a rental, and nobody rents a car to sit on a West Loop block for 2 hours. Alessandro set the gun on the table. Not away, not holstered. Just set it down the way you set a pen down when you need both hands for something else. He looked at the map still spread across the table, at Vivienne's legal pad, at the city outside the industrial windows going orange and gray in the early evening light. "How long do we have?" he said. "Before they move?" "Tonight. Maybe sooner." Carver's voice was flat. Donahue knew the layout of this floor. He knew the elevator sequence and the stairwell configuration. If he gave that to Marcelli's people, he gave them everything, Alessandro said. It wasn't accusation, just arithmetic. Carver nodded once. "Get the car around to the loading dock on Aberdeen," Alessandro said. "Take Santos and Riley. Don't use the main elevator." Carver left. The door closed. The room was very quiet for about 4 seconds, the specific quality of quiet that exists in the space between one version of a situation and the next. Vivienne picked up the legal pad. She wasn't sure why. It was instinct, the same instinct that made her pack the backpack 3 years ago and never fully unpack it. Information felt like the one thing that remained hers regardless of what happened to the room she was standing in. "You knew Donahue was a possibility," she said. "I knew something was a possibility," Alessandro said. He picked up the gun and put it inside his jacket. "I didn't know it would be him. 11 years. People change their minds for the right price." "Raphael doesn't pay for things," Alessandro said. "He creates obligations. Whatever he offered Donahue wasn't money." He looked at her. "You know how your brother operates. What would he have offered a man like Donahue? Senior, established, not desperate for cash?" She thought about it. She didn't want to think about it, but she made herself, going back to the version of herself who had spent 5 years inside Raphael's world, understanding the specific grammar of how he moved people from loyalty to compliance. "Donahue has something to protect," she said. "Raphael would have found it, a family member, a financial exposure, something that made the cost of saying no higher than the cost of yes." Alessandro was quiet. "That's how Raphael works," she said. "He doesn't buy people. He finds the thing they can't afford to lose, and he stands next to it. 11 years, Alessandro said again, quietly, and she understood that the repetition wasn't sentimentality. It was him recalibrating, rewriting 11 years of assessments and decisions through the new information. She didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say about that. They left the floor in 4 minutes. Down the stairwell, not the elevator, with Carver and 2 other men she hadn't met forming a loose perimeter that felt professional without feeling military. The distinction being that military moves in patterns and professionals move in response to what's actually there. The loading dock on Aberdeen was a narrow concrete space smelling of rust and old exhaust, and the car was already there. A different car from the sedan she'd ridden in from the restaurant. This one darker, more anonymous. She got in. Alessandro got in beside her. Carver took the front passenger seat. The driver she didn't know. They moved through the West Loop's evening traffic, and for 7 minutes nobody spoke, and Vivian sat with the backpack between her feet and the legal pad in her lap and watched the city pass and thought about Raphael. She thought about him specifically, not abstractly. She forced herself to do it the way she sometimes forced herself to press on the hip to assess the pain, deliberately, without flinching away, because flinching away was the thing that let it become worse than it was. Raphael was 43. He was her father's son from the first marriage, which meant he'd had 17 years before Vivian existed to understand exactly what kind of world their father was building and to decide that he wanted to inherit it. He was not stupid. That was the thing she needed to remember, the thing she allowed herself to forget in the years she'd spent trying to make him into something smaller, something she'd successfully escaped. He was precise. He was patient. He had waited 4 years to find her, and he had found her. "He's not going to attack your building," she said. Alessandro looked at her. "Not directly," she said. "That's not how he moves. He'll use the accounts Donahue gave him to create pressure, financial exposure. He'll put you in a position where defending me becomes more costly than releasing me." She paused. "He's done it before, with other people. He waits until the person protecting you calculates that you're not worth the cost. And then what? And then you let me go, and he has what he wants, and everyone else gets to go back to their lives. And you?" She looked at the city outside the window. "I told you, he's not going to let me walk away after." "I know," Alessandro said. "I'm asking what you're expecting me to do with that information." She turned to look at him. He was watching her with the same calibrated attention he'd brought to the restaurant, the same quality of looking that felt like being read rather than seen, and she was aware that her answer to this question was going to land somewhere that mattered. "I'm not expecting anything," she said. "I stopped expecting things from people a long time ago. I'm giving you information because information is what I have." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked forward, and she had the sense that something had been decided, though she couldn't have said exactly what. They were on the expressway now, moving north, and she didn't ask where they were going. The safe house was in Rogers Park, 2 blocks from the lake, on the 3rd floor of a 3-flat that looked exactly like every other 3-flat on the block. The apartment inside was small and functional and smelled faintly of fresh paint, the way places smell when they've been recently prepared for occupancy. Someone had put groceries in the kitchen. She could see the bags on the counter. And the windows had blinds that were already closed. Carver did a walkthrough, reported the space clean, took one of the other men and established something in the apartment below. The 3rd man remained outside. Alessandro sat at the kitchen table. She sat across from him. The groceries remained in their bags. "Tell me about the assets," he said. "The specific accounts, what's in them and how they're structured. Why? Because if Raphael is moving this fast, it means he needs those assets now, not eventually, now, which means there's pressure I don't know about yet." She thought about how much to say. Then she thought about the warehouse, about the way doors look from the inside when you don't have the option of opening them. "My mother had 2 accounts," she said, "set up when she married my father. He put property into them. 3 commercial holdings on the south side, 2 in Gary, 1 warehouse complex that was technically leased to a logistics company but functioned as a transit point for the organization. After she died, the accounts passed to me by the terms of the setup." She set the legal pad on the table. "I don't have the access codes. I never had them. But my signature is required for any transfer of the property titles. My legal signature on notarized documentation." Alessandro was very still. He can't access the assets without you, he said. He can't transfer them without me. He can use them as collateral in ways that don't require transfer, but to actually liquidate, he needs you standing in front of a notary. Yes. And he needs you to sign willingly because a coerced signature on a property transfer is contestable and he knows it. He looked at the legal pad. That's why Caruso said he wants to have a conversation. He needs this to look voluntary. I know. So he's not going to kill you, Alessandro said. Not yet. Not until the signatures are complete. That's the theory, she said. The theory also requires me to believe that Raphael will honor an implied agreement not to harm me once he has what he needs, which, she stopped, which is not something you believe. No, she said. It's not. Alessandro was quiet for a moment. Outside, wind moved off the lake and found the edges of the closed blinds, and the apartment made small sounds of settlement and weather. Why does he need to liquidate now, she said. That's the question I keep coming back to. Those assets have been sitting for 4 years. Why now? Because someone is putting pressure on him, Alessandro said. The kind of pressure that has a deadline. Another organization, possibly, or a federal case. He looked at her. In the last 8 months, there have been 2 significant indictments connected to South Side operations. Not directly Raphael's people. Adjacent networks. The kind of pressure that moves sideways. She felt something cold settle in her stomach. If Raphael is looking at federal exposure, he needs clean assets, Alessandro said. Liquidated, moved, unreachable. And he needs to do it before discovery proceedings lock everything down. Then the timeline isn't about me, she said slowly. I mean, it is, but it isn't. He's not moving fast because he found me. He's moving fast because he's running out of time. Which means, Alessandro said, that we have slightly more leverage than I thought, and slightly less time. She pressed both palms flat on the table. The legal pad was between them with her handwriting covering every line. 3 years of forced memory condensed into something that was now the most dangerous document in this apartment. What does leverage look like in this situation? It looks like having something Raphael wants and being in a position where he has to negotiate for it rather than simply take it. Alessandro looked at her. Which requires you to be inaccessible and visible at the same time. Inaccessible so he can't simply collect you. Visible so he knows you're not signing anything without an agreement. And what's the agreement? That's what we need to determine. His phone rang. He looked at the screen, and the quality of his stillness changed. Not dramatically, but she caught it because she had been learning his stillnesses the way you learn the particular sounds a building makes, categorizing them by what they meant. He answered, "Yes." A pause. His jaw set. "Say that again," he said. His voice was very even. Another pause, longer. "Don't do anything," he said. "I'll be there in 40 minutes. He ended the call and set the phone on the table and looked at it for a moment without looking at her. She waited. The lake wind found the blinds again. "Carver," he said, raising his voice just enough to carry. Carver appeared in the kitchen doorway within seconds. "Take her to the secondary location, the one on Morse. Don't use your phones once you're moving." He stood. "I'll call the landline when it's clear." "What happened?" Vivian said. He looked at her, and she saw something in his face she hadn't seen there before. Not fear. Alessandro Varelli did not appear to be a man who experienced fear in the ordinary sense, but the particular look of a person who has just been told something that requires them to revise a fundamental assumption. "Donahue didn't just give Raphael your location," he said. "He gave him the documentation on 3 of my primary holding accounts, the same accounts I use to manage operational liquidity." He paused. "Raphael froze them an hour ago through a shell entity Donahue set up, legally. On paper, those accounts belong to an LLC that Donahue has been building for 18 months. The room was very still. 18 months, she said. "Yes. Donahue has been working with Raphael for 18 months. At minimum." She thought about what that meant. 18 months of conversations, of operational details, of access and observation and the kind of accumulated intelligence that came from being inside an organization rather than simply studying it from outside. 18 months of selective leaking, of positioning, of preparing the specific mechanism that had just been activated. He wasn't turned, she said. He was placed. Alessandro looked at her. He was already Raphael's man when he came to you, she said. Or he was turned so early that the distinction doesn't matter. This wasn't opportunistic. This was constructed. The silence that followed was very long. How? Alessandro said, and the word was quiet and careful in a way that made it more frightening than if he'd shouted it. I don't know, she said. But Raphael has been planning this for a long time. Whatever this is, me, the assets, your organization, it's not a response to finding me. Finding me was part of it. She picked up the legal pad. He's been building something, and we walked into it. Carver was still in the doorway. He looked at Alessandro with the particular patience of someone who understood that the next instruction was going to determine the shape of the next several days. Alessandro picked up his jacket from the chair back. He was moving with the controlled efficiency of someone who had decided that analysis was over and action was the only remaining language. Go, he said to Carver. Carver put his hand on Vivian's arm, not gripping, just indicating, and she stood and picked up her backpack and the legal pad and followed him out of the kitchen. At the apartment door, she stopped. Alessandro. He was already on his phone. He looked up. Don't face him alone, she said. Raphael does his best damage to people who think they understand him. He held her gaze for a moment. Noted, he said. It wasn't reassurance, and she didn't want reassurance. She went through the door. The location on Morse was 12 minutes away by car, and Carver drove it in silence with the second man from the safe house in the back beside her, and the city running past in the particular stripped-down way it looked from the passenger seat at night when you weren't thinking about the city at all, just measuring it as terrain. The apartment on Morse was smaller than the one in Rogers Park. No groceries, a couch, a lamp, a window that faced a parking structure. Carver checked the space, confirmed it clear, and positioned himself in the front room without being asked. Vivian went to the window and looked at the parking structure and thought. She was very good at thinking under pressure. She had not always known this about herself. She had discovered it the hard way in the 6 months she'd spent disappearing, when thinking under pressure had been the difference between staying gone and being found. She worked through what she knew and what she could infer and what the shape of the situation looked like from Raphael's perspective rather than her own. Raphael had Donahue inside Alessandro's organization for 18 months minimum. He had the account documentation. He had Vivian's location until tonight, though Carver and Alessandro had moved fast enough that the Rogers Park apartment was likely compromised before they'd been there long enough for it to matter. He had the financial leverage to restrict Alessandro's operational capacity in the short term. What he didn't have, her signature, her physical presence, and whatever Alessandro was moving to do in the next 40 minutes. She thought about Alessandro, about a man who had just learned that his most trusted lieutenant had been his enemy for at least 18 months, which meant that 11 years of decisions, of trust, of operational security had been threaded through with a slow and patient betrayal that was now fully activated. She thought about what that did to a person. She thought about what it felt like to realize the walls of the house you were living in were not what you thought they were. She knew exactly what that felt like. She sat on the couch and opened the legal pad to a fresh page and started writing. Not what she knew about Raphael's assets. She'd already given Alessandro that. She started writing what she knew about Raphael himself. The way he thought. The sequence in which he made decisions. The specific vulnerabilities that he spent enormous energy concealing because he understood that a man's weaknesses were only weaknesses if they were known. She wrote for an hour without stopping. Carver brought her water at some point, and she drank it without acknowledging it and kept writing. When the landline rang, an actual landline mounted to the kitchen wall, which told her this apartment had been prepared for exactly this kind of night, Carver answered it and then came to the doorway. "He wants to talk to you," Carver said. She got up and went to the kitchen, picked up the receiver. "I need you to tell me something," Alessandro said. His voice was different. Not shaken. That wasn't the right word. Alessandro Virelli did not shake, but recentered, the way a gyroscope recenters when the surface beneath it has shifted. "Donahue called me." "When?" 30 minutes ago. "He says Raphael has made him an offer that supersedes whatever agreement he thinks he has with my organization. He says the offer includes my being brought in on a federal racketeering case that Donahue has been building documentation for. A pause. 18 months of documentation. She pressed her hand flat against the wall beside the phone. He's going to turn federal witness, she said. That's what he says he's prepared to do unless I agree to release you to Raphael's people within 48 hours. The parking structure outside the window was very still. A car moved through it somewhere on the upper level, headlights sweeping across the concrete columns, and then it was still again. He's lying, she said. About which part? He's not going to turn federal witness, she said. Raphael would never allow it. Donahue is Raphael's asset. If Donahue turns, he takes Raphael down with him and everyone connected to the organization for 18 months. Raphael doesn't build 18-month operations to hand them to a federal prosecutor. She kept her voice level, and she was aware of how much effort that was taking. This is a bluff. Raphael is using Donahue to apply maximum pressure in the shortest possible time because he needs those signatures and he needs them before his own exposure becomes unmanageable. Silence on the line. The question is whether you're willing to call it, she said. More silence. She could hear something in the background, voices, movement, the particular quality of a room full of people handling a crisis with disciplined quiet. If I call it and I'm wrong, Alessandro said, I spend the next several years in a federal case. Yes. If I don't call it, I release you to a man who will get what he needs from you and then make sure you can't discuss it afterward. Also, yes, she said. Those are the options. Those are the options. She waited. Outside, the car on the upper level of the parking structure found the exit and its headlights swung out onto the street and were gone. There's a third option, Alessandro said. I'm listening. We move first, he said, before Donahue delivers his next message, before Raphael's timeline reaches its pressure point. He paused. But to do that, I need the one thing I don't have. She already knew what it was. You need me visible, she said, not protected. Visible. You need Raphael to believe I'm accessible. I need him to believe you're willing to negotiate, Alessandro said. I need him to come to a table rather than send more Carusos. And the only way to make him believe that is if I'm the one who invites him, she said. The silence that followed was not the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of two people who have just arrived at the same conclusion from different directions and are taking a moment to confirm they're looking at the same thing. If I do this, she said, I need to know that you understand what I am in this situation. I am not bait. I am not a mechanism. I am a person who is making a choice to walk toward the most dangerous thing in my life because it's the only remaining option. Her voice was steady. I need to know you understand that difference. I understand it, Alessandro said. Say it. A pause. You're not bait, he said. You're making a choice. She looked at the kitchen wall, at the phone mounted there, at her own hand on the receiver, which was completely still. Then let's talk about how we do this, she said. But before she could exhale, before the next word could form, she heard it. The sound she had learned to hear in the 3 years she had spent running. The sound that was never random, never coincidental. The specific and unmistakable sound of a door latch on the floor below being worked from the outside. Then a second one. Above. Carver appeared in the kitchen doorway, and his gun was already in his hand, and his face said everything that needed to be said before either of them could speak. They had found the apartment on Morse. Carver moved first. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and killed the lamp with his free hand, and the apartment went dark except for the ambient orange of the parking structure filtering through the blinds. And in that half-dark, Vivian could see the geometry of the room rearrange itself into something tactical. The couch's cover, the kitchen doorway as a choke point, the window as an exit that would require going through glass and dropping 12 feet onto concrete. She still had the phone receiver in her hand. Alessandro, she said low and fast. They found Morse. How many? His voice went flat and operational immediately. Don't know yet. 2 entry points. Below and above. Get out of the building. Aberdeen side, not the street. A pause that lasted less than a second. I'm 12 minutes away. 12 minutes is a long time. I know. Another pause. Vivian, I know, she said, and hung up. Carver was at the apartment door with his ear close to the wood, not touching it, listening. The second man, she'd learned his name was Riley, late 30s, said almost nothing, had materialized from the front room and was at the window, 2 fingers separating the blind slats by a centimeter, looking down at the street. 2 on the street side, Riley said. One's moving toward the building entrance. Stairwell or elevator? Carver said. Stairwell. He's not waiting. Carver looked at Vivian. In the low light, his face was very calm in the way that faces were calm when calm was a professional requirement rather than an emotional state. The back stairwell exits onto an alley that connects to Aberdeen. We go now before whoever's below reaches this floor. And whoever's above, she said. Yes. So we're moving between them. Between them, he confirmed, without making it sound better than it was. She picked up the backpack. She picked up the legal pad and then she looked at it and left it on the counter because it would slow her down, and she had the critical parts memorized now, had been memorizing as she wrote, the way she'd memorized routes and names and account numbers in the disappearing years, because paper could be taken from you, and memory was the only thing that traveled with your body, no matter what. Carver opened the apartment door by degrees, leading with his weapon, and the hallway was empty and smelled of old carpet and the faint chemical residue of someone's cleaning product. The overhead fluorescent at the far end of the hall was out, which might have been coincidence and probably wasn't. They moved in order, Carver first, then Vivian, then Riley behind. And they moved fast, not running, the specific quick walk of people who understood that running created noise, and noise created information. The back stairwell door was at the end of the hall. Carver reached it and held up his fist without looking back, and they stopped. He listened at the door. Vivian listened too, and she could hear it. Footsteps on the stairs below, not rushing, controlled, the specific cadence of someone ascending with purpose and patience, someone who was not worried about being heard because they had people covering the exits. How far? She said, barely breath. Second floor landing, Carver said. Maybe. They had seconds. Carver looked at the door, at Vivian, at the hallway behind them, where the elevator sat at the far end with its indicator light showing the car was currently on the ground floor. He made a decision she could see forming in the set of his jaw. Elevator, he said. They'll have someone watching it. They'll have someone watching the stairs too. Elevator is faster. He was already moving back down the hall, and she followed because the alternative was standing in the hallway while someone came up the stairwell, and that was no alternative at all. The elevator was old, the kind with a door that had to be pulled manually, and then an inner gate that rattled when it closed, and every sound it made on the way down to the ground floor was a separate small catastrophe that she absorbed into her chest and didn't react to. Carver had his gun raised. Riley was watching the indicator panel as if he could make it move faster through the force of attention. Ground floor. The outer door opened onto a small lobby. Mailboxes, a rubber mat, a single overhead bulb. The front entrance was glass, and through it she could see the street, and the figure of one of Raphael's men paused on the sidewalk, looking at his phone, which meant he hadn't been alerted yet, which meant the men in the stairwell hadn't reached the apartment yet. 12 seconds, maybe. Carver angled toward the back of the lobby, where a door marked with a faded exit sign led, presumably, to the alley. He pushed through it. The alley was cold and narrow, and smelled of accumulated garbage and lake damp, and it was empty. Aberdeen was visible at the far end, maybe 60 feet of darkness and wet concrete between here and there. They moved. Vivian's hip was a sustained bright line of pain that she processed as information rather than sensation. It was there. It was limiting her to approximately 80% of her potential pace. It was not going to stop her. And she kept moving, backpack riding hard on her shoulders, Carver just ahead and Riley just behind, and the alley was the longest 60 feet she had experienced since the parking lot in Indianapolis. They came out onto Aberdeen, and Carver had his phone out and was making a call with his weapon still in his other hand in a way that was conspicuous enough that a woman walking a dog on the opposite sidewalk changed her trajectory immediately and didn't look back. "We're on Aberdeen, south side of the building," Carver said into the phone. "How far?" He listened. "Okay." He ended the call and looked at Vivian. 3 minutes. They'll find us in 3 minutes. Probably. He scanned the block. Keep walking, don't stop. They walked north on Aberdeen, and Vivian counted her breaths the way she'd learned to count them when panic was a present option that she was choosing not to take. And the city moved around them with the ordinary indifference of a city at night. People returning from restaurants and bars, a delivery cyclist threading through the parked cars, the general human texture of a neighborhood that had no idea what was happening on its block. Her phone, the one Alessandro had given her 2 days ago, clean, unconnected to her regular number, vibrated in her jacket pocket. She pulled it out. Unknown number. She answered. Vivian? The voice was one she hadn't heard in 4 years and had not missed for a single day of those 4 years. You've been busy tonight, Raphael. Her stride didn't change. She kept walking. Carver glanced at her and she held up the phone so he could see the screen, and his jaw tightened and he kept walking too. Raphael, she said, I've been trying to reach you through other people. His voice was exactly as she remembered it, measured, almost warm, the specific warmth of a man who had learned that warmth was an effective instrument. You've made that difficult. That was the intention. I know. A pause that contained something approximating amusement. I've always respected that about you, Viv. You make things difficult with remarkable consistency. What do you want? I want to talk, in person. I want to explain some things to you that I think will make the situation clearer. You sent men to a building where I was staying. I sent men to confirm your location. They weren't authorized to engage. The men in the stairwell didn't seem to know that. Misunderstanding, Raphael said. I'll deal with it. Another pause. I want a conversation, just the two of us. No Alessandro Varelli, no Carver, none of that. You and me, the way we used to talk. We never used to talk, she said. You used to tell me things, and I used to comply or face the consequences. Silence. A longer one than she expected. I was wrong about how I handled things, he said. The warehouse, I've thought about it. What I asked my men to do, I've thought about it. She stopped walking. Carver turned. She held up one hand to stop him from saying anything. You've thought about it, she said. Yes. And I'm telling you I was wrong. His voice was still level, still that same measured warmth. I'm also telling you that the situation has changed in ways I didn't anticipate when you left. There are pressures, legal pressures. You know about the accounts. You've obviously told Varelli about them, which I understand you were in a difficult position. But those accounts are something I need to resolve, and I'm asking you directly to sit down with me and work out an arrangement. A car turned onto Aberdeen from the north end of the block, headlights sweeping, and for 1 second she couldn't see anything. And then it wasn't Alessandro's car, it was just a car, and it passed them and moved on. What kind of arrangement? She said. The kind where you walk away from this with enough money to never work a restaurant shift again, he said. The kind where I get what I need from those accounts, and you get your freedom. Legitimate, documented, permanent. She heard the specific texture of the lie. Not in the words. He was good enough that the words themselves were almost credible. She heard it in what the words didn't contain. There was no acknowledgement of risk to him in this arrangement. There was no concession of power. There was nothing in it that a man in Raphael's position would offer, unless the thing he was offering was not actually what he intended to deliver. Where? She said. A beat. You'll meet me? I'll consider it, she said. Send me a location by 10 tomorrow morning. I'll let you know. She ended the call before he could respond. Carver was looking at her. You're not actually considering... I'm considering everything, she said. That's different from agreeing to it. Alessandro's car came around the corner from the north, and this time it was actually his car, and it pulled to the curb without its lights cutting out first, which told her Alessandro was past the point of worrying about being seen. She got in. He looked at her in the back seat, and she could see immediately that something had changed in him since the phone call from the Morse apartment. He was operating at a different temperature, still controlled, still precise, but with the particular heat of someone whose calculation of acceptable risk had just expanded significantly. Donahue is in federal custody, he said. He turned himself in 2 hours ago. She stared at him. He wasn't bluffing. He wasn't bluffing. Alessandro's voice was very even. He spent 18 months building a case, and he just handed it to a federal prosecutor. My name is in it. My accounts are in it. 3 years of operational documentation. He paused. I have approximately 72 hours before the indictment becomes public, at which point everything I've built becomes a legal case rather than a functioning organization. The car was moving. She didn't know where. Raphael called me, she said. Alessandro looked at her. He wants a meeting tomorrow morning, location TBD. He offered me money and freedom in exchange for the signatures. She watched his face. He knew about Donahue going federal. He had to. The timing is too precise. Raphael put Donahue in federal custody, Alessandro said. Not a question. Working it out in real time the same way she was. He built the documentation through Donahue. He controls when it gets handed over, which means he controls the timeline. He's using your legal exposure as a clock, she said. Sign the assets over to him, or he lets the federal case proceed and takes us both down. Not you, Alessandro said. Your name isn't in the federal case. Not yet, she said, but I was in his organization for 5 years. If he decides to add documentation, he won't, Alessandro said. He needs you functional and credible to execute the property transfers. A woman under federal investigation can't sign notarized documents as a free legal actor. He paused. He needs you clean. For now. For now. The two words sat between them in the car like something with weight. He's going to meet me, she said, at whatever location he sends tomorrow. I'm going to go. Alessandro was very still. I'm not debating it with you, she said. He won't negotiate with you in the room. He'll only move if he thinks he's managing me directly. And I need to be in the room with him to understand what he actually has versus what he's threatening. And if what he actually has is enough to follow through, then we know that, she said, which is better than not knowing. You're describing walking into a room with your brother who broke your leg the last time you told him no. I know what I'm describing, she said. The car had stopped. She hadn't noticed. They were in a parking structure, different from the one by the Morse apartment, larger, the kind attached to a commercial building. And the engine was off, and Carver and the driver were both looking straight ahead with the professional discretion of men who understood they were not part of this conversation. Alessandro looked at her for a long moment. She held it. Not alone, he said. He'll know if... Not negotiating that, he said. You go in. I'm outside with enough people to change the situation if it changes. You have a phone. He looked at the clean phone in her hand. Keep the line open. Don't announce it. Just keep it open. She thought about the warehouse, about the closed door, and the two men and Raphael standing back with his arms crossed, in that particular posture of his, that meant he had already decided and was simply executing the decision. She thought about what it had felt like to understand, in that room, that her choices had been removed before she'd even walked in. Okay, she said. The location came at 9:47 the next morning. A text from a number she didn't recognize, 3 words and an address. Calumet Industrial Complex. South Side. She looked it up. An abandoned manufacturing facility near the river, the kind of place that had been closed for 15 years and changed hands twice in real estate deals that never resulted in development because the environmental assessment kept finding things in the ground that nobody wanted to pay to remove. The kind of place where the acoustics made it hard to know where sound was coming from. She told Alessandro. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the address. Then he made 2 calls she wasn't present for and came back with the expression of someone who had just done a rapid assessment and arrived at an answer he didn't love but could work with. I know that building, he said. There's a secondary entrance on the riverside, loading dock, steel door. It was used for equipment delivery when the facility was running. My man Marcus was inside it 3 years ago for a different matter. He paused. There are columns. Heavy structural columns running the length of the main floor. Good cover, bad sightlines. Raphael will have people inside, she said. Yes, so will I. If your people are inside before I arrive and he detects them, They'll be there before his people arrive, Alessandro said. Marcus knows the layout. We move first. She spent the rest of the morning in controlled stillness, the way she'd learned to spend time before difficult things. She didn't rehearse what she would say to Raphael. Rehearsing was a trap. It made you rigid, committed to a version of events that rarely survived contact with the actual situation. Instead, she thought about Raphael's priorities and worked backward from them. He needed the signatures. He needed her cooperative or convincing enough to pass notary scrutiny. He needed the property transfers completed before the federal indictment became public. That was his architecture. Everything else, the warmth in his voice, the apology for the warehouse, the offer of money and freedom, was furniture arranged to make that architecture invisible. She understood, with the particular clarity that came from stripping a situation down to its actual components, that she was not going to walk out of that building with an agreement. She was going to walk out of it having either forced Raphael's hand or having confirmed what Alessandro needed to know to move against him. Either way, she was going in. The Calumet complex in the early afternoon was a monument to something that had stopped mattering. Chain-link fence with gaps that suggested the perimeter security was aesthetic rather than functional. Concrete loading docks with weeds growing through the expansion joints. Windows that had been boarded, and then had their boards tagged, and then had the tags bleached pale by seasons of weather until they looked like abstract art no one had commissioned. She arrived in a car she didn't recognize, driven by someone she'd never met, because Alessandro had specified that nothing connected to his organization's known vehicles approached the building. She got out 3 blocks away and walked. The compression sleeve was tight on her hip, and she walked straight and even, and didn't give the limp any more space than it was already taking. The main entrance was a roll-up door, the kind designed for equipment, now permanently open because the mechanism that closed it had failed a decade ago. She walked in. The interior was enormous. The structural columns Alessandro had described ran the full length of the space in 2 rows, massive, poured concrete, the kind that had been built for a century of use and would outlast whatever century decided to stop using them. Light came in through the high windows in long, angled bars that made the dust in the air visible and the shadows between the columns dense. Raphael was at the center of the space. He was taller than she remembered. Or she remembered him wrong, which was possible. Memory of people you feared tended to edit them into something that matched the fear rather than the fact. He was wearing a coat that cost more than 2 months of a restaurant salary, and he had 3 men with him, positioned at respectful distances, and he was standing with his hands in his coat pockets in a posture that was studied in its casualness. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. "You're walking better," he said, "than I expected." She didn't respond to that. "Sit down, Tom," he said, and gestured to 2 chairs that had been placed in the center of the floor between 2 of the columns, facing each other, the specific theater of a prepared conversation. She sat. He sat across from her. His men remained where they were. She could hear from somewhere in the building behind her the particular absence of sound that was not actually absence but was people being very quiet, and she didn't know if it was Alessandro's people or Raphael's, and she kept her face arranged into something neutral. "Tell me what you actually want," she said. "Not the version you prepared, the actual thing." Raphael looked at her. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly, more like the adjustment a person makes when they encounter a version of someone that doesn't match their working model. "I want the transfers," he said. "The 3 commercial properties on the south side and the Gary holdings. The warehouse complex is already handled through a different mechanism. I want those 5 properties transferred to a shell entity by the end of the week. And then you're free," he said. "Money in an account you designate. Enough that working matters because you want to, not because you have to." And Alessandro Virelli. Raphael's expression didn't change. "That situation resolves itself," he said. "The federal case proceeds. He manages it or he doesn't. That's not your concern. You built that case through Donahue." "I built it with documentation that exists," Raphael said. "Whether Donahue built it or I built it, the documentation is real. Virelli's organization has been operating in ways that federal prosecutors find interesting. That's not something I manufactured." "You controlled when it was activated," she said. "Yes," he said without apology. That's a different thing. She looked at him, at the face she had spent 4 years trying to make into an abstraction, something she could hold at the appropriate distance of someone who had survived a thing, rather than someone who was still in proximity to it. Up close, he was not an abstraction. He was a man in an expensive coat in an abandoned building who had spent 4 years and considerable resources finding her. "The warehouse," she said. "You said you thought about it." Something moved across his face. She watched it carefully. "Yes," he said. "And your conclusion?" "My conclusion is that I made a decision under pressure that I wouldn't make now," he said. "My conclusion is that our father's methods were not always the right methods, and I applied them when I should have found a different approach." She listened to the words. She listened to what was underneath them. "But you still need the signatures," she said. "Yes." "So the apology is functional." He was quiet for a moment. "The apology is real," he said. "The need for the signatures is also real. Those two things exist simultaneously." She looked at the columns on either side of them, at the angled light from the high windows, at the three men positioned at their respectful distances. "I'm not signing today," she said. Raphael's stillness changed quality. "I need documentation," she said, keeping her voice level. "Legal review. An agreement in writing about the payment and the conditions of release. I'm not walking into a notary's office on your timeline without—" "Vivian." His voice had lost the warmth, completely, the way a light goes out rather than dims. "I've been generous with the timeline for this conversation. I'm not going to be generous with the timeline for the decision." "I'm not refusing," she said. "I'm asking for 48 hours and a written agreement. You don't have 48 hours to give me." He leaned forward slightly. "The federal indictment becomes public in 60 hours. Once it's public, the accounts associated with your mother's name will be examined as part of the asset disclosure. At that point, the transfer becomes legally complicated in ways that will take years to resolve. I need this done before that happens." He paused. "I'm giving you until tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. You'll come to a location I'll send tonight, with a notary I've arranged, and you'll sign the documents. And if I don't? Then the documentation your friend gave the prosecutor gets supplemented with materials connecting your activity to the organization during your time working logistics." He said it without heat. "You were part of this organization for 5 years, Vivian. I have records. Whether or not you chose to leave, the records exist." The space between them was very quiet. She heard it then. The smallest sound from somewhere in the shadows to her left, between two of the columns. A boot on concrete, the briefest contact, immediately stilled. Someone adjusting position. Someone who had been standing in place long enough that their legs needed a moment. Raphael heard it too. His eyes moved to the left, then to her. "You brought someone," he said. "I told you I would consider the meeting," she said. "I didn't tell you I would come alone." He stood. His three men moved in response, a choreography so well practiced it was nearly simultaneous. His hand went inside his coat. From the shadows on both sides of the building, the situation changed. Alessandro came out of the dark between two columns on the right side, moving fast and without hesitation, and he was not alone. Marcus and two others emerged from the left, from the positions they had held since before Raphael's people had arrived, and the geometry of the space rearranged itself in approximately 4 seconds, from a prepared negotiation into something considerably more immediate. Raphael's three men had their weapons out. Alessandro's people had theirs. The structural columns made the sightlines complicated in both directions. Nobody fired. The moment hung in the industrial space with its angled light and its dust and its weight of accumulated years. Raphael looked at Alessandro across the floor. Alessandro looked back. And in the space between them, Vivian stood up from the chair and turned to face her brother with the full weight of everything she'd been carrying for 4 years. And she did not move toward cover, and she did not flinch. And her leg was a line of fire from hip to knee, and she stood on it anyway because sitting down in this moment was not something she was willing to do. "This isn't how this ends," she said to Raphael, her voice carrying in the concrete space with a clarity that surprised her. "You don't get to stand in a room with a gun and call it a conversation." Raphael looked at her. His expression was something she couldn't fully read, which was new. She had always been able to read him, had learned to do it young for the obvious reasons. But what was on his face now was not the controlled warmth and not the cold utility of the threat he'd just made. It was something she didn't have a word for. "Put it down," Alessandro said to Raphael's men, and his voice in the concrete space had a quality that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with what you understood was behind it. Raphael's hand was still inside his coat. "Raphael," Vivienne said. He looked at her. "It's already over," she said. "You built this for 18 months, and it's over. The only question left is what it costs you." His hand came out of his coat slowly, and in that moment, in the specific quality of that slowness, in the thing she finally couldn't read on his face, she understood something she hadn't let herself understand before, something that was going to make the next 60 seconds either the end of this or the beginning of something far worse. Raphael's hand came out of his coat empty. It was such a small thing, a hand, open, coming out of a coat, 4 fingers and a thumb and nothing in them, and yet the entire industrial space seemed to reorganize itself around that emptiness, the way a room reorganizes around a sound that stops. Nobody moved for a full 3 seconds. Then Raphael said something low to the man on his right, and the man's weapon came down, and then the second man's, and then the third's, and the concrete space breathed out something it had been holding since Alessandro stepped out of the shadows. Alessandro didn't lower his. Not immediately. He held it another 2 seconds, looking at Raphael across the floor with the assessment of someone who understood that a hand coming out of a coat empty was data, but not yet a conclusion. Then he said something equally quiet to Marcus, and Marcus and the 2 others maintained their positions, but eased their stances by a degree that was professional rather than trusting. Vivienne stood between all of it and breathed. Raphael looked at her, not at Alessandro, at her. And the thing she hadn't been able to read on his face a moment ago resolved itself into something she could name now, though naming it didn't make it simpler. He was tired. Not the tiredness of a man who hadn't slept, the other kind. The kind that accumulated across years of building things that required constant maintenance and constant defense. The kind that settled into the architecture of a person and changed how they stood. "Sit down," she said to him. Not a command. Something closer to the way you'd say it to someone you were genuinely concerned about, which surprised her when she heard it come out of her own mouth. He looked at her for a moment. Then he sat back down in the chair across from hers. She sat too. Between them, the abandoned floor of the Calumet complex held its industrial silence. Alessandro remained where he was, near the column. His men remained in position. Raphael's men held their ground. The negotiation of the space continued without anyone acknowledging it explicitly. "Donahue is in federal custody," she said to Raphael. "Whatever you built through him, you've lost control of the timing. He handed the documentation over voluntarily, and the prosecutor has it, which means you can't pull it back." "I know that," Raphael said. "So the leverage you had over Alessandro, the 60-hour window, the indictment timeline, that's not yours to manage anymore." "I know that too." "Then what are you actually holding?" she said. He looked at his hands. It was a gesture she didn't associate with him. Raphael Marcelli had spent 20 years constructing a version of himself that didn't look at his hands, that held eye contact the way people held territory. Watching him look at his hands was like watching a load-bearing wall develop a crack. "The federal case has my name in it," he said. "Not just Virelli's. Donahue was my asset, which means the 18 months of documentation traces back through me. The prosecutor has a thread and she's going to pull it." He paused. "I needed the assets liquidated and moved before that happened. The timeline was mine, whether I wanted it or not." "So this entire operation," she said slowly, "was a response to your own exposure." "Partly. You weren't moving against Alessandro because of the organization. You were moving against him because you needed clean assets before a federal case ate everything you have." "Partly," he said again. "What's the other part?" He was quiet for a moment. The dust moved in the angled light above them. Somewhere in the building's old bones, wind found a gap, and the structure made a low, settling sound. "I found you 8 months ago," he said. "Not 3 months ago, not recently. 8 months. I knew you were at Castellano's. I knew your name. I watched from a distance for 8 months before I sent Caruso." She looked at him. "I watched you for 8 months and you were—" He stopped. looked at his hands again. You were managing. You were moving through that restaurant with a leg that should have put you in rehabilitation, and you were carrying plates and learning the room, and you were not asking anyone for anything. He paused, and I kept thinking about the warehouse. The silence that followed was the heaviest one yet. I kept thinking about it, and I couldn't. He stopped again, and she watched him work against something that was clearly not comfortable to work against. I'm not asking for absolution. I'm not making this into something it isn't. I did what I did in that warehouse, and it was a decision, and I made it. He looked up at her. But I watched you for 8 months, and I couldn't move. And then the federal pressure started, and I didn't have the option of not moving anymore. Vivian sat with that for a moment. She let it be what it was, well, not an excuse, not a redemption, just the specific and limited truth of a man telling her something she hadn't known. You still sent Caruso, she said. Yes. You still threatened to add documentation connecting me to the organization. Yes. You still built a coercive operation designed to extract what you needed, and then… She didn't finish the sentence. Yes, he said. And he didn't dress it up, which was the thing that made it harder rather than easier. He just said yes, flatly, and let it sit. Alessandro spoke from behind her. The property transfers. Raphael looked at him. They don't happen, he said. Without her voluntary participation, any transfer is legally vulnerable. I know that. The federal documentation, Alessandro said. I can't pull it back, Raphael said. Donahue acted outside my control. The timing of the handover was his. But the documentation itself, Alessandro said. The materials Donahue built over 18 months. Your fingerprints are on the construction of that case, which means you're exposed in the same direction you were pointing. Raphael said nothing. Which means, Alessandro said, moving slowly toward the center of the space, his weapon now at his side rather than raised, that what we have in this building right now is 3 people who all have significant federal exposure and none of whom benefits from the current situation continuing. Vivian looked at Alessandro. He was looking at Raphael, and the quality of his attention had shifted from the tactical assessment of the last few minutes into something colder and more considered. What are you proposing? Raphael said. I'm not proposing anything yet, Alessandro said. I'm observing that the structure of this situation has changed since you designed it. Donahue changed it. And in the structure as it now exists, you don't have the leverage you had 24 hours ago. Neither do you, Raphael said. Your accounts are frozen. Temporarily, Alessandro said. The freeze was executed through a shell entity that Donahue built. When Donahue turned federal, he became a witness in a case that implicates that shell entity. My attorneys will have the freeze lifted within 96 hours. Raphael stared at him. You didn't know that, Alessandro said. It was not a taunt, just confirmation. He told me the freeze was ironclad, Raphael said, and something in his voice had the quality of a man revising an entire architecture in real time. He told you what you needed to hear to move at a timeline he chose, Alessandro said. Donahue was working his own strategy. He used both of us. The 3 of them sat with that. Vivian in her chair, Raphael across from her, Alessandro standing between the columns. And the building made its low settling sound again, and outside, somewhere on the river, a boat horn called once and went silent. It was Vivian who spoke. The federal case is real, she said. Donahue's documentation is real. Both your names are in it, and nothing that happens in this building changes that. She looked from Raphael to Alessandro and back. So the question isn't about leverage anymore. The question is whether either of you wants to spend the next 4 years in federal proceedings, because if this continues… She stopped. Let the if continue to hang. If this continues, that's what happens. The case proceeds, both organizations are exposed, and whatever was built over however many years gets dismantled publicly and expensively. You're proposing something, Raphael said. I'm describing a situation, she said. The same way Alessandro just described a situation. I'm not a negotiator. I'm a woman who has been running from this room her entire adult life, and I am very tired of running, and I would like this to be finished. She looked at her brother. I'll sign the documentation on the Gary properties, not the Southside holdings. Those go into a trust under independent management with a board I approve. The warehouse complex is off the table entirely because it has a federal flag on it already. and touching it exposes everyone. She paused. The Gary properties give you enough liquidity to manage the immediate federal pressure if you use them correctly. You know that. Raphael studied her. In return, she said, the documentation connecting me to the organization during my years in logistics gets destroyed. Not archived. Destroyed. I want confirmation from the federal prosecutor's office that my name does not appear in any materials submitted to the case. I can't control what the prosecutor— You built the case through Donahue, she said. You know exactly what materials were submitted and what was held back. I'm asking about the held back materials. He was quiet for a long moment. And Virelli, he said. She looked at Alessandro. He was watching her with an expression she was learning, the one that meant he was following her thinking and had decided to let it run rather than redirect it, which was the closest thing to trust she'd seen him offer anyone. Alessandro manages his own federal exposure, she said. That's not mine to negotiate. But the offensive components of what you built against him, the shell entity, the account freeze, whatever additional pressure you had staged, those get unwound. You pull back completely. You're asking me to walk away from everything I built over 18 months, Raphael said. I'm asking you to walk away from a building in the South Side before someone makes a decision that turns this into something none of us can manage, she said. The 18 months is gone regardless. Donahue made sure of that. The silence stretched. Raphael looked at Alessandro. Alessandro looked back at him with the specific quality of someone who had made his calculation and was waiting for the other person to finish making theirs. The Gary properties, Raphael said finally, and the documentation on your logistics work gets destroyed. Confirmed in writing, she said. From your attorney to mine within 48 hours. You don't have an attorney. I will by tomorrow morning. Something happened in his face. She wasn't sure what to call it. It was the ghost of something that might, under different circumstances, have been the beginning of a different kind of relationship between two people who shared a parent and very little else. The South Side Trust, he said. Who sits on the board? People I choose, she said, not connected to either organization. I want approval rights on the board composition. You get consultation rights, she said, not approval. He looked at his hands again, then he stood. The three men behind him adjusted their positions, and he made a small gesture that settled them back. 48 hours for the written confirmation, he said. 48 hours, she agreed. He looked at her one more time before he turned toward the roll-up door. The look held something unresolved in it, something that was not quite regret, and not quite the absence of regret either, and she held it without looking away until he turned and walked toward the light. His men followed. Their footsteps crossed the concrete floor and the roll-up door framed them briefly against the gray afternoon outside, and then they were gone, and the building held the silence of their absence. Alessandro stood where he was for a moment. Then he lowered his weapon fully and put it away and walked toward her, and she was aware that her legs were not entirely steady, and she stayed in the chair rather than try to prove otherwise. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her. The Gary properties, he said. You gave him something real. I gave him enough to survive, she said, which is different from giving him what he wanted. He wanted the full portfolio. He needed survival. People in the position Raphael is in confuse those two things because they've been building for so long they can't tell the structure from the ground anymore. She exhaled slowly. The Gary properties are worth enough to manage his immediate federal pressure. They're not worth enough to rebuild from. He knows that. He accepted it anyway. Because the alternative was this room continuing, she said. And whatever Raphael is, he's not stupid. Alessandro was quiet for a moment. The dust moved in the light above them. The building made its low sound. Donahue, she said. The federal case. My attorneys move on the account freeze tomorrow, he said. The case itself. He paused. It's real, the way you said. There's documentation there that requires managing, not fighting, managing. He looked at her. That's going to take time. How much time? Years, he said, without softening it. Not prison time, legal time. The distinction matters, but it's not comfortable. She nodded. She'd expected that. She'd done the arithmetic of it in the Rogers Park apartment the night before and arrived at something approximate to what he was describing. The restaurant, she said. He looked at her. Castellano's. I want to go back. She watched his face. Not as an employee. Marco wants to sell. Has wanted to sell for 2 years. He told me once, during a slow shift when we were waiting for the last table to close out, he said he was tired of being responsible for the thing every single day. She paused. I want to buy it. With what capital? He said, not dismissively, just as a practical question. With the management fee from the Southside Trust, she said. It'll take time to structure, but the trust generates income and I'm the administrator. She looked at her hands, the same way Raphael had looked at his earlier, except when she looked at her hands, she was looking at them as instruments rather than as evidence. I know how to run a restaurant. I've been studying it for 6 weeks from the floor. I know what Marco does wrong, and I know what he does right, and I know the room better than he does at this point. Alessandro was quiet for a moment. You're going to need legal support for the trust administration. Yes? And for the property transfer documentation. Yes. My attorney can facilitate both, he said. If you want. She looked at him. At the careful neutrality in the way he'd phrased it, the option left open rather than assumed. If I want, she repeated. That's what I said. She stood up. Her hip registered the full weight of the last 24 hours in one sustained complaint, and she absorbed it and straightened and looked at him at close range, which was a different thing from looking at him across a table or across a car's back seat. Up close, in the industrial light of a building that smelled of concrete and old machinery and the particular quality of time that had stopped, he looked like a man who had been carrying something for a long time and was only recently aware of the weight. I want, she said. The drive back across the city was quiet, in the way that things are quiet after they've been loud for a long time, the silence having a different texture from the silence before. Carver drove. Marcus rode in front. Vivian sat in the back beside Alessandro and watched the south side give way to the city's middle, and then to the river, and then to the neighborhoods that lay between the river and the lake. And the afternoon light was doing something specific to the buildings, the particular amber of Chicago in the early hours before the sun finished its work. She called Marco from the car. He picked up on the second ring, the way a man picked up who had nothing particular to hide from anyone who might be calling. Vivian, you're coming back? I'm coming back, she said. I also want to have a conversation about the restaurant. When you have time. A pause. What kind of conversation? The kind where you tell me what you'd need to see from a buyer, she said, and I tell you what I'd need to see from a seller. A longer pause. Then Marco said something she wasn't expecting, which was, I was wondering when someone was going to ask. She smiled, which was the first time she'd done that in what felt like several years, though it had only been about 2 days. The weeks after the Calumet complex had the quality of reconstruction rather than recovery. Recovery implied returning to a previous state. What was happening was something that had no previous version to return to. She went back to Castellano's on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after the building, on a night when the dining room was 3/4 full and the piano was playing something low and undemanding. She came in through the front entrance instead of the service door, which she'd never done before. Marco met her at the maitre d' stand and looked at her for a moment with the particular look of a man who was performing the math of a situation he understood had changed. Table 9 is available, he said. She looked at him. I'll take the office, she said. If that's all right. They spent 3 hours in Marco's office with coffee neither of them drank and legal documents that his attorney had prepared and that she'd had Alessandro's attorney review. The terms were reasonable. They were reasonable because Marco genuinely wanted to sell and she genuinely wanted to buy, and neither of them had an adversarial interest in the outcome, which was a novel experience for a negotiation she was conducting, and she noted it as such. She signed at the bottom of the final page, and Marco signed below her and his attorney witnessed it, and it was done. 22 years of Marco's ownership transferred into something new in the space of a pen moving across a line. You're going to change things, Marco said, not accusingly. Stating, some things, she said, not all of it. The osso buco stays. He laughed, which she hadn't heard him do before, and it changed his face in a way that made him look 10 years younger and considerably less tired. She walked through the dining room on her way out. The room was winding down. The the last tables occupied by people finishing their wine, the staff beginning the quiet choreography of closing. She moved through it without hurrying, and she did not vary her path, and she did not compensate on the right side, and the hip was a dull, manageable pressure rather than a bright line. Because she'd started the physical therapy she'd been avoiding for 3 years. Twice a week with a therapist Alessandro's doctor had recommended who worked with old injuries rather than fresh ones, and understood the difference. She was not going to walk without the limp. She'd accepted that in the 3rd session when the therapist had been honest with her in the way that good therapists were honest, directly and without apology. The fracture had healed wrong, and the nerve involvement was permanent, and the best she could realistically expect was management rather than resolution. She had looked at the therapist and said, "Management sounds fine," and meant it. The federal proceedings took the shape Alessandro had predicted. His attorneys moved on the account freeze and had it lifted in 89 hours. The case itself produced a period of legal complexity that lasted, in total, 27 months. Not prison, not the end of his organization, but an expensive and sustained engagement with the machinery of federal scrutiny that required attention and resources, and the particular endurance of someone who could hold a position under sustained pressure. He held it. Raphael's situation was more complicated. The Gary properties liquidated in 6 weeks and bought him the buffer he needed for the immediate federal pressure, but the broader case moved in directions that reduced his operational capacity significantly. He retained his freedom, which was the outcome his attorney had considered the primary objective. He retained less of the organization than he'd started with. He retained, as far as Vivian could determine from her careful distance, the specific and tiring awareness of a man who had conducted a 20-year campaign and arrived at something smaller than he began. They spoke twice in the months following Calumet. Both conversations were brief and conducted through attorneys for the trust documentation. They were not the conversations of a brother and sister. They were not the conversations of enemies. They were the conversations of 2 people managing a legal relationship with the professional correctness of people who understood that warmth was not the appropriate register and hostility was not the productive one. She thought occasionally about the 8 months he'd watched her move through the restaurant before sending Caruso. She thought about it, and she didn't know what to do with it exactly, whether it was evidence of something or simply the complicated arithmetic of a person who had done damage and then hesitated and then done it anyway. She put it in the category of things she could hold without resolving, which was a category she'd been building for years and had become reasonably adept at maintaining. Donahue pled guilty to federal conspiracy charges 14 months after the night at Calumet and was sentenced to 4 years. Alessandro attended none of the proceedings. He made one statement to his attorney about the matter and then did not speak of it again in any conversation Vivian was present for, which told her what it cost him in a register that was more precise than anything he might have said directly. The restaurant opened under new management, under her name, her ownership, her vision, on a Thursday in late October, 6 months after the signing in Marco's office. She had spent those 6 months in the specific and absorbing work of renovation that didn't change the bones of the place, only what it felt like to be inside it. The kitchen got new equipment. The dining room kept its amber lighting but lost some of the Baroque weight that had made it feel, on certain evenings, like an apology for itself. The staff changed gradually, not through displacement, but through the natural attrition of people who left and were replaced by people she chose, people she interviewed herself, people she looked at with the particular attention she'd learned from months in proximity to a man who believed that looking carefully at someone was the most basic form of respect. She hired Lena back, which surprised Lena, who had assumed that the change in ownership meant the change in everything. "You're good at the room," Vivian told her, in the brief interview that was not really an interview since the decision had already been made. "You make people feel like the room is glad they're there. That's harder to teach than anything else." Lena looked at her with the expression of someone who had just been told something true in a place where true things were not common currency. "Okay," she said. "Good," Vivian said, and moved on. Alessandro came to the opening. He arrived at 7, without announcement, without the particular theater of his arrival at Castellanos all those months ago. He came in through the front door like an ordinary person, and he was shown to a table, not table 9, which was occupied by a party of 4 celebrating something loud and pleasant, but a table near the window where the light was good and the room was visible. She came to his table herself because she wanted to, not because anyone had assigned her to it. "Good evening," she said. He looked up at her. The gray eyes were the same. Everything about him was essentially the same, which she had come to understand was not inflexibility, but a quality of having been made from something durable. "How's the hip?" he said. "Managed," she said. "You want to see the menu, or do you know it?" "I've been here twice in the last month," he said. "The Bronzino is better than it was." "I changed the sourcing," she said. "And the prep time. Marco was rushing it. It shows." She stood beside the table for a moment. The room moved around them in the way rooms moved when they were doing what they were built to do, people eating and talking and not thinking about anything more demanding than the evening in front of them. "I have something for you," she said, and reached into the pocket of the jacket she'd started wearing on the floor because she was the owner now, and she could decide what the floor looked like, and set a folded piece of paper on the table. He looked at it, picked it up, unfolded it. It was a document from her attorney. Confirmation from Raphael's legal team that her name did not appear in any materials submitted to the federal case, and that all held-back documentation connecting her to the organization had been permanently destroyed. Alessandro read it and then refolded it and set it on the table. "It came yesterday," she said. "I was going to call. I thought this was better." "It's better," he said. She looked at him, at the table, at the document between them, at the window behind him where the city moved in its ordinary way. She thought about the night she'd walked to his table at the old Castellanos with her leg burning and her heart doing its ugly thing and her hands arranged carefully around a serving tray so that nothing she was carrying would show. "Do you want to know something?" she said. "Yes." "I'm not afraid of this room anymore," she said. "I've been in it almost every day for months, and for the first 6 weeks I was afraid of it because I was hiding something, and a room full of people is a room full of eyes. And now—" She looked at the floor, at the tables, at the way the amber light caught the glasses, and turned them briefly into something worth looking at. "Now I just think it's a good room, and I built it." Alessandro looked at her. Not the cataloging look he'd given her across the restaurant that first night. The lens-quality observation that recorded everything and revealed nothing. Something different, something that had a temperature. "You didn't build it alone, Danae," he said. "No," she agreed. "But I built the parts that matter." He looked like he was going to say something. Then he looked at the menu instead, which told her what she needed to know about the particular version of restraint he was still practicing, the kind that was not distance but patience, the kind that understood that some things needed the space of ordinary time to become what they were going to become. "The Bronzino," he said. "Good choice," she said. She walked back across the room to the service station, and she did not vary her path, and she did not compensate, and the limp was visible and present and hers, and the room did not stop or shift or rearrange itself around it because the room had other things to attend to. She put in the order and stood for a moment at the service station with her hand on the cool edge of the marble counter, feeling the weight of the evening distributed through her feet, the way weight was always distributed through a body that had learned to stand in the place it was standing rather than the place it had come from. The piano started something new, something in a minor key that moved slowly and didn't apologize for it. The room filled and continued to fill, and the night came down over the city outside the window, and Vivienne Marcelli, who had called herself other names, who had hidden her name the way she'd hidden her limp, who had built a life out of concealment and then built another one out of the ruins of the first, stood in the restaurant that was hers and watched the room she'd made from the room she'd been given, and did not look toward the door because there was nothing chasing her through it anymore. The nightmare was finished, not cleanly, not without cost, not in the way that stories sometimes ended, with the debris swept and the damage invisible and the people standing in the light as if the dark had never touched them. The darkness had touched her. It had touched everyone in this story. It had left its specific and permanent marks on bone and history, and the record of things done and not done. But she was standing in her room at the end of a Thursday in October, and the Bronzino was on the pass. And Alessandro Virelli was at the window table being patient in the way he was patient, and the night outside was just the night, ordinary and cold and full of the city's relentless ordinary noise. She picked up the plate and carried it across the floor.